nice to turn it around the right way and get it working, I guess. My name's Alastair Wilson. I retired from the London Hospital 5 years ago now. I still do a day a week on the trauma take, and I now am the medical director of East Anglian Ambulance, which is a charity that works with the ambulance service in the east of England. And my job is to go through a bit of the history, I think, also looking at what doctors may or may not bring to the pre-hospital party. I want to remind you that diseases and trauma are always changing, and we've got to keep up with that. And then I want to look a little bit about how we should find out whether doctors delivering pre-hospital care are making a difference. What should we be measuring, and what should we be doing for the future? Just to remind you, this is the graph of the population of London and Greater London, and around about 1985 to 1990, where my story begins in this stuff, there was 7 million people in London and one pre-hospital care doctor. So what do we bring to the party? How do we get to where we are now, particularly in the UK? You'll notice that Charles II, he had a stroke on February the 1st, 1685. His doctors were fabulous. They were really, really good. They knew what to do with strokes, so they purged him, they shaved him, they put a hot poultice on his head, and then they gave him an enema with all sorts of horribleness in it. And then they made him drink a solution of goat bezoar from a goat's stomach, drunk from a skull. I mean, that was the evidence base of the time, wasn't it, really? Anyway, a week later, Charles II succumbed. He died, presumably from his medical treatment. One wonders what people will think about our treatment in 20 or 30 years' time. When we go just a little bit closer to the present day, 80-odd years ago, George V had COPD, and he was busy trying to die, and they didn't want the red-top newspapers to report this, and so the president of the Royal College of Physicians of the United Kingdom was taken to Sandringham to look at the king, and decided that if he was going to die at the right time, they would have to orchestrate this. So he was given a large dose of diamorphine and cocaine, and died in time to get into the Times newspaper. Cause of death? The doctor. So going back to this sort of era, 1938, there were 3,137 hospitals in the United Kingdom. Just think how few there are now. 700 general and teaching hospitals, 235 maternity, and so forth. And at that stage, ambulances were staffed by doctors run from hospitals. And you remember at that time in America, they couldn't afford the ambulances, so they ran their patients in hearses. Interesting. The only transport that you could lie flat in. So after the war, what essentially happened was everybody did something different. In Europe, the Franco-German model, so-called, developed with doctors and with paramedics and nurses in the front line. And the idea was to bring the hospital to the patient. Evidence for that? Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And generally speaking, patients then went straight to wards rather than going to emergency departments. And the organization was a health organization. And the philosophy was stay and play. Whereas in England and America, well, paramedics with a bit of medical oversight was usually the order of the day. Bringing the patient to the hospital was the idea, direct to the emergency department. And it was a very militaristic system usually, St. John, but certainly a military modern, and it was a load and go system. Let's get there fast. Now, in the United Kingdom, there were some trials at trying to get pre-hospital care orchestrated by doctors. And in the 60s, a guy called Kenneth Easton, with a colleague who was a scrap merchant on the A1, decided that they were going to start a medical model. And that went on to look after the center of the United Kingdom, particularly up and down the A1 motorway. And in 1977, an organization called BASICS, the British Association for Immediate Care, was formed. And it's now spread over the whole of the United Kingdom. So it's probably true that there has been some medical activity in Great Britain at the roadside for many years, but of very variable quality. Often just a GP working, although it could sometimes be somebody of a lot more experience. So in 1980, the NHS was like this. They wanted everybody who worked in pre-hospital care to be primary care. Accidents were to be attended by the ambulance service, usually only, and transport to hospital was to be ordered by general practitioners, very general in a sense, or from 999 calls from the public. The government were very hostile to out-of-hospital practice at that time. They didn't support helicopters. In fact, they were radically opposed to helicopters and helicopter delivery of doctors or health. And they were content at that stage for a broken system to continue. And that went on until this paper was published. And it was a study of 1,000 deaths, commonly known as the 1,000 Deaths paper by Ian Anderson, Miles Irving, de Dombel, and so forth, and Marion Woodford. And they looked at 1,000 consecutive deaths from injury. And you'll notice 514 patients were admitted to hospital alive, and of course that meant that the rest of the 1,000 weren't. But of the 102 deaths in hospital, 20% were clearly preventable. And indeed, 2/3 of all non-central nervous system deaths were preventable. And the median age, again, as you would expect, 41-ish. And it was thought at that stage that, again, failure to stop bleeding, all the usual things, hypoxia, delays in surgery, patients being taken to the wrong place, were the things that were fundamentally wrong with the system. And at that stage, this is a long time ago now, trauma centers were recommended. We do things fast in the United Kingdom. Anyway, of the 100 that we put into this 1,000 from the London area, we noted that 86% of the patients that I'd had to do with died fundamentally from their head injury. We thought about 1/3 died unnecessarily, both in and out of hospital, but mostly it was impossible to tell. If they went to the wrong hospital first, we knew there was a 4-hour penalty because it took 4 hours to get from the wrong hospital to get to the right hospital. And the deaths were all occurring in the wrong hospitals. That is where they hadn't got the specialties to look after the patients. So our map was showing the need for a system change and for pre-hospital medical provision that wasn't then available. Just to remind you, deaths in the United Kingdom at that stage, 80,000 a year, commonest cause of death under 40, trimodal distribution, 30% preventable. At that stage, we went to Mrs. Thatcher and said, this is the situation. And she thought that 1 helicopter, 6 pilots, and a doctor would be a good idea. Unfortunately, she hadn't told the NHS or the Department of Health, who thought it was a very bad idea, and there was something of a war at the time. However, Mrs. Thatcher always had her way, and she did on this occasion too. Let me leave that for a minute and just talk for a moment about diseases and trauma and the fact that they're changing. Every year, 500,000 people die in the United Kingdom. That's a map of everything that they die from. Don't worry about looking at it, that's not important. But the red areas are the ones which pre-hospital care can have anything to do with. That's asthma at the bottom right. We have a vanishingly small amount of trauma now from many causes. So now just 137 deaths in a year from accidents at work. Just 1,800 died from road traffic crashes last year. If you look at the map for that, it was an all-time high during the war at about 9,000, just under 8,000 in 1966, and then it's just done a precipitate fall ever since. And it's settled quietly at that, and who knows what's going to happen with autonomous cars. Is it going to get worse? Is it worse or better? Who's for better? Interesting. Inspiration here, great. And when you actually look at the things that have made differences, obviously seatbelts made a difference, and then speed cameras start. Oh, whoops, what happened with speed cameras? It all went hopelessly wrong. We clearly didn't like speed cameras, and we didn't take any notice of them. But hey, we do know that things are getting better and better. How many people died from suicide in the United Kingdom? 6,000? Yeah, 6,000. It's a very worrying number. Almost 5,000 men, 1,500 women, and the majority die from strangulation. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do anything about because so often we get there and we're far too late and it's irreversible. Yet, we can be confident we've got lots of work to do out there, 30,000 cardiac arrests. Except, of course, that's also going down too. And most of us, I think, are seeing the number of arrests we're being called to beginning to tail off. Now, in the United Kingdom, we reckon there are more than 10,000 deaths each year from falls from standing, but we're still playing catch-up with the States. So if you look at the figures for the United States, the numbers of unintentional falls and death rates in adults over 65, it's going up radically, mostly in the white Caucasian group, not in the Afro-Caribbean, interestingly. But again, the mortality rate accounts for 40% now in the United States of all injury deaths, and it's the leading cause of death in the United States for people above 55 years of age. So we've got a different sport, a different game to play. So I want to come back to whether doctors that deliver pre-hospital care, do they make a difference? How can we find out? So when we started the helicopter service in London, the results were looked at really, really closely by this chap, John Nicol. And it may be on the balance of possibilities that at that stage, way, way back, we were actually contributing to 1 extra survivor per month. But overall, the whole research said there is no evidence that that's HEMS, improves the chance of survival in trauma, full stop. Dimitriades, way back in 96, said in 1996, pointed out that just patients being brought in by private transport, interesting figure, isn't it? The crew mortality 9.3, non-EMS 4, but when it's adjusted and the mortality is adjusted, still it's better to be taken in by your average Uber. Did you see the Uber story this morning in the press? Interesting. So, is that still holding the same now? Well, this is last month, or month before, February, the Wandling study, now looking at 103,000 patients. There's a clue here. Big data is going to give us all the answers that we'll ever probably need to know who's making a difference in the front line. But interesting, isn't it? So this really different system from ours, entirely different from the way that we do it in Europe, or indeed in England, seems to be having a radical effect. You'll note the Canadian conclusions by Moshe Lieberman a few years back, which was hilariously funny, because it showed that when he compared 3 separate systems, one with physicians, the physicians brought a tremendous increase in risk. Anybody with ALS was risky, so he felt very much that people should be just rushed to hospital. But of course, that's not us. So in the United Kingdom, just going through all the literature that we've got, Keith Willett's done this now on a couple of occasions, looking at the Cochrane database. Again, 5 out of 9 multivariate regression studies indicate improved survival. Well, that means 4 didn't. And the same thing here. Is it the H, the helicopter, or is it the EMS that's making a difference? There is usually some evidence of survival, but we don't know whether that's really real or not. Is it? I don't know. So, again, half don't show anything, half do. So the current view. I think it's probably fair to say that penetrating injury does best when transported as fast as possible to the place where you can stop the bleeding. No matter how you look at it, fast seems to be good. But blunt injuries do seem to do better with scene intervention, with a calm approach, with gentle resuscitation. So what should we monitor? Well, we've looked very closely at our TARN data. the Trauma Audit Research Network data, works across the whole of the country in the United Kingdom. But we work very closely with our own trauma centre from East Anglian Air Ambulance, and we look at all the patients that we feed into that system. So what is our contribution, that is the air ambulance's contribution to what goes on in the hospital? So we can look at ourselves a bit as if we were a hospital, but a segment of it. Just a word on Tarn. If you look at the Tarn statistics over the United Kingdom at the moment, the London hospitals are doing really, really badly. And the London hospital, which, as you know, I work in 1 day a week, is doing really badly. And we think that that's probably as a result of the pre-hospital effect of an increasing amount of stab wounds, injuries, and gunshot wounds. And the reason this is biting us is because the times to get the patients in are getting longer and longer because it's difficult for us to fly out to pick the patients up. And therefore, the doctor can have very little effect because there's such a big area to cover, and you haven't got a doctor to deal with it. So what's wrong? I mean, we can do thoracotomies, we can do thoracotomies at scene. You have to be good to do thoracotomies, you have to be up to speed. Is it reburn? I don't think so. That doesn't seem to be associated with big numbers of patients doing well. So how do we analyze this data from Tarn? Again, you have your European injury database, and we have the Tarn one, and it looks at the number of additional unexpected survivors or deaths in any cohort. And it divides everybody into percentage survival bands between 0 and 100, and then assesses the difference between expected survivors and actual survivors. And then it adjusts that number to prevent large survival bands. If, for example, I did really, really well with all the people that we really expected to die, I might think, oh, I'm so good, I'm going to have thousands of patients I'm saving, but that wouldn't be a realistic figure. So again, it has to correct for that. So our EAAA analysis did that. We looked at all of our data shoved into the MTC, the local trauma center, and we assessed ourselves as if we were the hospital and used the PS scores to stratify our data. And we compared expected and actual survivor numbers, did everything it says on the packet, and then we analyzed, interestingly, the survival rates based on mode of transport, just to see if that did make a difference. Just to remind you, that's the sort of the graph you get, and if you did that, where the little green spot is up on the top right is the number of extra saves per 100 that EAAA get taking into this one trauma center. So 9,100 patients taken in over a 4-year period, 580 patients acceptable to go into Tarn. And you'll notice, therefore, as we were thinking before, as Hans was saying, there's an awful lot of patients who aren't going to benefit by living or dying here, but again, patients that one goes to because it's good to do so. But again, most patients not sick enough for entry. So 580 returns. And when we look at that, 14% die. That's the age range. Just go through this quickly. That's just the mechanism. And you'll notice that with the mechanism, it's still vehicle collision that is predominantly the thing that's pulling us. The falls are coming up, 50 and 63, so 113 coming. And when you look at all the data, that's how it works out. Those are the stratification bands, the different survival bands as you go on, numbers in group. Again, you see 8 with 3 actual survivors. That could skew quite badly, so that gets corrected down. Once it's all corrected and added up, it comes to 5.34. Now, over the last 4 years, each year has been 5 or 5, it goes up to 5.6. Quite a good figure. Kind of encouraging. How much it means, lots of us will argue about, but it's at least an objective figure. Did the helicopter have an effect? Well, we look at a subset analysis, and it does appear that there may be a difference of about 1 between the ground ambulance group and the helicopter group, but still looked after by physicians at sea. We've also been trying to look at our cardiac arrest data. Now, it's interesting. When you actually look at, say, in the east of England, you suddenly find that everybody says, oh, you've got an overall survival rate of just under 8%. Oh, really? That's awful. That's really bad. We're not doing awfully well. And then we look at the database that the Poor Old Ambulance Service are using. We find it's hopelessly out of date, it's inaccurate, it's incomplete, but they've let us now curate it, which is really kind. And we found that all the air ambulance patients that we were looking after from several different air ambulances were not being entered into the data set. So we looked at the patients that we were taking into one particular hospital, which we felt did really badly. I mean, I hate to say this, but some, you get this feeling about a hospital that it's not doing awfully well. And we thought, oh, Papworth, they're always saying no. Oh. Anyway, we looked at 27 patients that were entered into their PCI pathway that we'd taken straight to them after post-ROSC. And horror of horrors, 18 patients were successfully discharged, 66%. Good Lord. And I mean, they were a bit shocked because they thought that we blocked all their ITU beds forever and that nobody ever went home. And in fact, this wasn't true. Average survival for those that died was 2.67 days. And again, of those that were discharged, again, an average of 8.5 days in the hospital. So it wasn't anything like as bad as they or we'd thought. Interesting how information changes attitudes. So what's the future direction for that? Well, unless we can have a system that links everything that's happening in pre-hospital care with everything that's happening in hospital and everything that's happening afterwards with outcome data, we will never know anything. So we are really, really pushing to make sure that all of our ambulance service data set is linked right into the hospital's data set and linked into what's going on outside by way of the community, and that's the ICNARC, the Intensive Care Network, HES data, MINAP. And of course, all these data sets at the moment aren't fantastic, but they won't be fantastic until we pay attention to them and make a difference. We also now produce cardiac arrest outcome data for each of both ourselves, and that shows on the left-hand side those that don't do quite so well. Again, 67% witnessed, but 28% only by standard CPR and 28% with the shockable rhythm. But on the right, those that have done well, 74% witnessed, 83% by standard CPR, and shockable rhythms, 52%. Exactly as you'd think. But it's very encouraging when everybody sees this. And when your ambulance service we give them this one, it's very similar in many respects, and suddenly they see that their survival rates are going up, the patients leaving hospital are going up, that's very, very encouraging to them. We're also being a bit naughty and looking at individual doctors and paramedics just for fun. And that's what happens when you look at your, well, that's your docs, and that's your paramedics. So one day, I guess, we're going to know who's really doing better. So future directions. Pre-hospital medical intervention does make a difference, I have no doubt, but we must monitor it, record it, and compare it. And I agree with Hans. And big data holds the answers to what improves mortality and morbidity, and we need to therefore share that across Europe. I know England are Brexiting and doing other stupid things, but hey, that's governments for you. And disease processes are changing about us. So we mustn't invent answers to problems which no longer exist. We've got to be really careful about that. And then we've got to think about what to do about age and fragility. And at my age, you have to accept it with grace. Anyway, thank you.